2.5 miles inside the longest cave on Earth, in a passage where no daylight has ever reached, a man is lying under a rock. He has been lying there since roughly 445 years before the birth of Christ. The stone that came down on him weighed close to 6 tons, and it caught him across the body while he was kneeling. He had time, that's the part I keep coming back to work one arm free and turn his head. And then he stopped. When they found him in 1935, his skin was still on him. The cave had dried it and kept it, the way the cave keeps everything. His stomach still held his last meal, hickory nuts and sunflower seeds, eaten some 2,400 years ago, a few hours before the rock came down. Scientists could read the contents of his final lunch. That is how completely he had been preserved, and how completely he had been forgotten, all at once. For 100 years before anyone ever laid eyes on his body, the people of Kentucky had been telling each other stories about what haunted Mammoth Cave. Ghosts, monsters, a woman screaming in the dark. This is the thing that haunted it, not a spirit, and not a monster, and not a murdered bell wandering the black water. A man, a worker, crushed at his job, who lay where he fell for longer than most nations have existed. And he never left that cave, not because his spirit couldn't, but because his body was never able to. That is a much simpler explanation for a haunting. It is also a much worse one. If you took one of the old lantern light tours through Mammoth Cave, the kind they ran through the 19th and early 20th centuries, you'd have heard the stories long before you ever saw a body. The guides told them well. They had to. In a place that swallows sound and gives it back warped and distant, a good story is half the ticket. They'd tell you about the woman who walks Echo River. Melissa, they called her, a young woman in love with her tutor, who did not love her back. And so in a fit of jealousy, she led him deep into the cave, took his lamp, and left him in the dark to die. He was never seen again, and Melissa, they said, still wanders the passages calling his name, her voice coming up out of the earth in screams that visitors swore they could hear over the water. They'd tell you about the figures at the edge of the lamplight that were there and then weren't, and guides who swore they'd felt a hand on their shoulder in a chamber they knew to be empty. And they'd tell you about the mummies, the cave people, preserved by the dry air, some claimed found sitting upright, as though they had paused mid-breath a few thousand years ago. There were bodies displayed inside the cave in those years, propped near the tour routes. And part of the thrill was walking past them and wondering whether the eyes had followed you. Here is the key to this whole thing. Every one of those stories has something real underneath it. Not real in the way the guides meant, but real. There were bodies in that cave, people who died in the dark and people who were laid there on purpose, and their remains really were preserved well enough to look, in the wrong light, like something that might still be watching. The strange part is not that Kentucky invented ghosts. Every place with a graveyard invents ghosts. The strange part is what Kentucky invented them out of, and what it did to the real people once it had them. So let's start with who was actually down there. The human history of the region runs back around 12,000 years, but the part that matters begins somewhere between 5 and 4,000 years ago, when people from what archaeologists call the late Archaic and early Woodland periods walked into the cave and kept walking, not a few feet past the entrance. Miles. Artifacts have turned up as far as 12 miles in. In passages you have to crawl and climb and squeeze to reach, carrying nothing but a bundle of burning cane to see by. They were not lost, they were working. They had come for the minerals in the walls, gypsum, mirability, epsomite, the pale crystalline crusts that bloom on limestone in a dry cave. They scraped these crusts loose with tools made from mussel shells carried up from the Green River, gathering the soft mineral into containers to carry out. This was not a quick errand. It was an operation, and it went on and off, for something like 1,000 years, until the mining stopped around 200 years before Christ, and the cave went quiet for 2 full millennia before anyone came again. To reach the good mineral, you had to go deep, past the point where any light from the entrance could help you, sometimes crawling on your stomach, carrying your own fire in your hands the whole way. If your torch went out, you were finished, alone, miles inside a mountain, in a dark so total it has physical weight. These people did that route over and over, for centuries, as a job. We don't entirely know what the minerals were for. Medicine, maybe. Trade. Ritual. The record doesn't say, and I'd rather tell you it's unknown than invent a reason. But here is what the record does say, loudly, in thousands of objects still lying where they were set down. These were skilled, deliberate, unafraid people who went further into the dark than most modern cavers would go without a helmet and a team on the surface. They left woven fiber sandals still holding the shape of the feet that wore them. Gourd bowls. Caches of unused torches, set aside for the next trip that, for some of them, never came. And drawings on the walls, carved and drawn in charcoal, miles from the nearest sunlight. The place that later generations found so frightening they had to fill it with murdered women and stalking monsters, these people worked in it, by firelight, comfortably enough to stop and make art a half-day's crawl from the sun. Whatever fear lives in Mammoth Cave did not come from them. It's ours. We brought it down there thousands of years later, and then we blamed the cave for it. So let me say plainly, what Kentucky spent 100 years dancing around. The thing that haunted Mammoth Cave was real. It was a series of human beings, actual people, with names we will never know, who went into that cave to work and, in some cases, died there. They lay in the dark for 2,000 years and more. And when they were finally found, by accident, the people who found them saw a ghost. A curiosity. A business opportunity. The title of this video makes a promise, and I want to keep it now. What Kentucky believed was haunting Mammoth Cave was real, and it was buried there for 2,000 years and more. That is not a tease. It is settled. It is history, and you can read it in the National Park Service's own records. So the question the rest of this answers is not what was it. We already know it was them, the people in the dark. The real question, stranger and heavier than any ghost story, is this. What did we do to them once we found them? Because the answer to that is the actual haunting, and it is not the dead who come out of it looking bad. To answer that, we have to go back before Lost John, to the body that started it all. Sometime around 1811, in a smaller cave in the same Kentucky system called Short Cave, a group of men digging into the clay floor struck something hard and flat. It was a stone, deliberately placed. When they levered it up, they found a crypt underneath, and in the crypt was a body. She had been buried sitting up, surrounded by rock, roofed over by that single flat slab. She was wrapped in 2 deerskins worked with leaf and vine patterns, and interred with tools and ornaments. Everything about the way she had been placed said she mattered to the people who put her there. This was not a body discarded. This was a burial, done with care, for someone the archaeologists later judged to have likely been a person of standing in her community. The dry cave air had done to her exactly what it would later do to Lost John. Her hair was still on her head, cut short. Her teeth and nails were intact, in near-perfect condition. She had been a tall woman, close to 6 feet, and she had been down there, seated in her sealed crypt, for well over 2,000 years before a man's shovel hit the edge of her roof. A real person, buried with love, older than the Roman Empire. Now watch what we made of her. She was dug up and taken out, which nobody at the time thought twice about. In the early 19th century, an ancient body was not an ancestor. It was a find, something you could sell. In 1816, a wealthy Ohio businessman named Nahum Ward came through and understood exactly what he was looking at. Not a person, but an opportunity. He offered her to the American Antiquarian Society, one of the oldest learned institutions in the country. And they turned him down. because their experts had decided she was a hoax, a fake, not worth their shelf space. So Ward bought her himself, her, and several other bodies, and a pile of artifacts, and took the whole collection on the road. She became a traveling exhibition, something you paid to file past in a hall in Lexington. And then another town and another, for years. And here's the twist that tells you exactly how the value of a dead woman worked in that century. Not long after Ward's roadshow started drawing crowds, the same antiquarian society that had dismissed her as a fraud sued for custody of the body they'd called fake, and in 1817 they won. She had been worthless to them right up until the moment she started drawing a paying audience. She didn't have a name yet. The name came later, and this is my favorite documented detail in the whole story, because you can watch a legend get born in a single sentence. In 1852, a writer named Nathaniel Parker Willis visited the collection, got flowery about her, and called her Kentucky's posthumous belle. And out of that one man's turn of phrase came the name that stuck for 2 centuries. Fawn Hoof. That is not what her people called her. Whatever her real name was, the name her mother gave her, the name spoken over her when they laid the stone across her crypt, that name is gone. It died with the last person who knew it, thousands of years ago. What we have instead is Fawn Hoof, a phrase a magazine writer reached for in 1852, because it had a nice ring and suited the little romance he was spinning about a dead woman he'd never met. A pretty invention, sitting where a real name used to be. Under that invented name, she kept traveling. She was exhibited at the 1876 World's Fair in Philadelphia, and again at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago. Thousands upon thousands paid to look at her. And then, in the late 19th century, she was handed to the Smithsonian, where researchers took her apart to study her, wrote up their findings, and then lost the body. Simply misplaced her. For years, no one could say where she was. She was eventually rediscovered, her bones disarticulated. In a storage box. That's the Ark. A woman buried with love and ceremony, dug up, declared a fraud, sold, renamed by a stranger, paraded across 2 World's Fairs, dissected, and then lost in a box in the basement of the nation's museum. Every step documented. None of it a ghost story. All of it worse than one. And then, because the truth apparently wasn't enough, people started adding to her. This is where we cross from history into folklore, and I don't want to smudge the line. Everything I'm about to describe is invented. None of it is true. But the inventions are real, in the sense that people really did say them, print them, and believe them. And the way they piled up tells you something about us that's almost as unsettling as the cave itself. It started with her hair. Somewhere in the retellings, Fawn Hoof's short dark hair became red hair. And once she had red hair, she couldn't just be a native woman from the Kentucky woodland anymore. Because in the imagination of the tellers, red hair meant she came from somewhere else, from across an ocean. So the next layer got added. She had been embalmed, they said, like the ancient Egyptians. The wrapping, the preservation, the care of the burial, all of it got folded into a theory that Egyptians, or some lost white civilization, had reached North America thousands of years ago, and that Fawn Hoof was the proof. Newspapers ran with it. Some reported, flatly, that she was of Amazonian descent. The Chicago Tribune, the Atlanta Constitution, real papers, printing that a woodland woman from a Kentucky cave was evidence that everything you'd been taught about American history was a lie. You have seen this exact machine before, if you've spent any time in these stories. It's the same engine that turned a single unusually tall man into an entire race of 10-foot red-haired giants at Lovelock Cave out west. It starts with one real detail here: a careful burial and preserved short hair that may have carried a reddish cast, and then someone nudges it. Short hair becomes red hair. Red hair becomes foreign hair. Foreign hair becomes proof of Egyptians in Kentucky. Each teller reaches for the version the last one didn't have the nerve to say, and by the time it's fully grown, the actual woman at the bottom of the pile has vanished, replaced by a costume that fits somebody else's theory. And notice who that theory served. Never her. It served the people who wanted to believe the impressive things in ancient America came from somewhere else, from Egypt, from a lost white race, from anywhere but the native people who were actually here. Turning Fawn Hoof into an Egyptian wasn't a harmless fancy. It was a way of using a native woman's grave to argue that native people couldn't have built their own history. The lie had a job, and the job was erasure. And here's what gets me. The truth was always more than the myth needed her to be. She didn't have to be Egyptian, or 10 feet tall, or the last survivor of a drowned civilization. She was a woman important enough to her own people that they buried her sitting upright in a stone crypt, wrapped her in deerskin they had decorated by hand, and sealed her under a slab meant to hold for a very long time. That is not the smaller story, it's the bigger one. It's just a true one, and true ones have never sold tickets as easily as the ones we make up. Which brings us back to the man under the rock. Lost John was found on the 7th of June, 1935, by 2 cave guides, Lyman Cutliff and Grover Campbell, leading a civilian Conservation Corps crew, building a better trail. He was on a ledge about 20 feet above the floor, in the southeastern reaches of the main cave. What had happened to him was almost unbearably ordinary. He had been kneeling, working gypsum loose from the ceiling, the same job thousands of his people had done for 1,000 years, when the breakdown shifted. A slab of limestone came down and pinned him, and he got his head and one arm clear, and there was nothing else he could do. Once the anthropologist had studied him, read the seeds in his stomach, and dated the cloth found with him to within a few decades of 445 BC, they did the thing that, by this point, you can probably predict. They put him on display. For decades he lay behind glass, on the tour route, a scheduled stop. People came down off the surface, out of the Kentucky sun, paid their admission, and filed past the body of a man who had died at work 2,400 years before their grandparents were born. Guides pointed him out. Children pressed up to the glass. He was a highlight, listed alongside the rock formations and the underground river. Everyone looked at him the way you look at an exhibit, because an exhibit is what we had turned him into. And I want to sit in how strange that is, because it's the least supernatural thing in this entire story, and the one that unsettles me the most. Nobody filing past that glass case thought they were looking at a haunting. They thought they were looking at a show. The ghost of Mammoth Cave, the thing Kentucky had whispered about for 100 years, had a ticket price and an open viewing schedule. We didn't fear him. We sold him. So what about the hauntings? The wails, the figures, the moving mummies? If the bodies were real, were the ghosts real too? No. And the honest answer is more interesting than a yes would be. The preservation has a plain cause. The cave air is dry. The soil is loaded with nitrates, and dry, nitrate-rich conditions will mummify a body slowly and completely without anyone intending it to. That's the whole secret of the Egyptian embalming. There wasn't any. The cave did it the way it has always done it, to more than one person, not just Fawn Hoof and Lost John, but others, including a child the showmen took to calling Little Alice. Different bodies, different centuries, the same dry chemistry. No ritual, no lost technique. Just the air and enough time. There's a darker wrinkle too, the myth-making machine caught in the act. Several of the bodies displayed as Mammoth Cave mummies weren't even found in Mammoth Cave. They'd been taken from other Kentucky caves and brought here, because Mammoth was the famous name, the one that sold tickets, and the stories quietly gave the impression they'd all come out of these passages. The legend didn't just inflate the bodies it had, it imported extras. The sounds have a cause too. Mammoth Cave is over 400 miles of mapped passage, some of it dropping 30 stories deep. And sound behaves strangely down there. It carries impossibly far, bends around corners, arrives from directions that make no physical sense. An underground river a few hundred feet off, heard through a wall of rock, can sound uncannily like a voice. In the dark, with a guide who has just finished telling you about the woman who wails for her murdered love, you do not need a ghost to hear one. Your own ears will build her for you. And Melissa herself, searching Echo River for the tutor she killed? She was never real, not even in the way the mummies were. She was invented whole, as fiction, in a New York newspaper in 1858. A writer made her up. She has haunted the cave for over a century and a half, and she was born on a printing press. Even the cave's most famous monster is a rental. In 1905, a young writer named H.P. Lovecraft borrowed Mammoth Cave for one of his first stories and filled it with a stalking, pale, half-human thing that was never there either. So the mechanics all resolve. The air explains the bodies. The acoustics explain the voices. The newspapers explain the ghosts. Every piece comes apart cleanly in your hands. Except one thing doesn't, and I don't think it's supposed to. If the cave was already full of the genuinely dead, real people, really buried, really down there for 2,000 years, then why did we need to invent ghosts at all? We had the real thing, we walked right past it. And instead of seeing the people who are actually there, we made up spirits and monsters and murdered women and sold tickets to those instead. That's the part that stays strange, after everything else is explained. Not the cave, us. There is an end to this, and it's a quiet one. Sometime in the 1970s, the thinking finally began to change. Displaying the dead behind glass, as a stop on a guided tour, stopped looking like education and started looking like what it always was. And so Lost John was taken down. He was reburied somewhere inside the cave, close to where he had fallen, the exact spot known only to the superintendent of the park. Deliberately. He was put back into the dark, and the location was kept, so that no one would ever come to see him again. In 1990, the principle behind that quiet decision became federal law. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, established a simple thing that had taken the country 2 centuries to arrive at. The ancestral dead are not exhibits. They are not property. They are not attractions. They are people, and they go home. Institutions that had spent generations filling boxes and glass cases with human beings began the long, uncomfortable work of giving those people back to the communities they had been taken from. I'm not going to tell you that fixed everything, because it didn't. Fawn Hoof spent decades lost in a Smithsonian storage box before anyone even went looking, and when they finally did, it took months of searching to turn her up, catalogued and forgotten. There's a great deal of this history that runs the wrong direction, but I think the reburial of Lost John, done in silence, in a spot deliberately chosen to be forgotten, is the closest thing this story has to a right ending. The machine that turned a dead miner into a ghost, then a curiosity, then a stop on a guided tour, finally switched off. Nobody sells a ticket to him anymore. He went back into the ground he was found in, and this time we agreed to leave him there. So here is where we land. Somewhere in 426 miles of mapped passage, in a cave so large they are still finding new corridors every year, a man is buried again, close to where a 6-ton stone came down on him 24 centuries ago. No marker, no glass. The people who once lined up to see the ghost of Mammoth Cave will never find him now, And that is exactly the point. The haunting was always real. That was never the lie. There really were people in the dark, and they really never left. The lie was in what we decided they were. We were told a ghost and a monster and a murdered woman searching a black river, and underneath every one of those stories was a real human being who went into the earth to work, or was laid there with love, and who deserved to be left alone. And here's the last thing, the thing I can't get out of my head. The first people down there were not afraid of that cave. They made art in it by torchlight, a half-day's crawl from the nearest daylight. You can still see the scrape marks their mussel shells left in the walls, still find the burned-out cane torches where they dropped them, still trace the drawings they left miles from the sun. They walked into the deepest black on the continent, over and over for 1,000 years, and they were fine. It was work. It was ordinary. It was theirs. We are the ones who filled it with ghosts. We came along thousands of years later, found the people they'd left behind, and could not simply see them for what they were. So we made up a wailing woman, a stalking monster, an Egyptian princess, a race of giants, and we charged admission to all of it. The only thing that was ever truly haunting Mammoth Cave was us, walking past the actual dead, inventing spirits so we'd never have to look straight at the real people in the ground. They were real, they were buried there for 2,000 years, and they were never, not once, what we said they were.